Greetings, I'm Susanna Clark, Director of the Mahindra Humanities Center and the Morton B. Knopfel Professor of Music at Harvard University. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's very special occasion of the 2022 Rita E. Hauser Forum, featuring the iconic artist and memoirist, Alison Bechdel. 11 years ago, a generous gift from Rita E. Hauser established this forum. Rita Hauser is an international lawyer. She has served in various capacities on the national and international stage, focusing on global peace and human rights, including serving as United States Ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council. Rita Hauser was awarded the Harvard Medal in recognition of her distinguished service to Harvard University. She is a champion of the arts, and her vision for the Hauser Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center was to bring to Harvard's campus major figures in the arts to reflect on their own artistic practices and on the state of the arts more generally. Previous Hauser Forum luminaries have included author Ian McEwan, filmmaker Mira Nair, director Steven Spielberg, writer David Grossman, playwright and actor Anna Deavere Smith, and pianist Emmanuel Axe. I am pleased to say that Rita Hauser joins us today as a member of our webinar audience. Welcome, Rita, and thank you for your tremendous support for today's event. We are extremely proud to have Alison Bechdel as our 2022 Hauser Forum artist. Alison Bechdel is celebrated for her comic strip Dykes to Watch Out For, which was syndicated in some 50 alternative newspapers and translated into multiple languages. Although the series began as vignettes with Bechdel's characteristic aperçu, it turned into a serial with a cast of regular characters, most of whom were radical lesbians who debated real-world politics and ways of relating to each other and the world. Dykes to Watch Out For ran for 25 years from 1983 to 2008. And for so many of us in the LGBTQ community, the comic strip served as a weekly lifeline in an often hostile political and cultural climate. Bechdel's 3 graphic memoirs are groundbreaking for their subject matter and their mode of storytelling and graphic portrayal. The first 2, Fun Home and Are You My Mother, are profound studies of Bechdel's relationship with her father and mother. Both offer poignant insights into the human condition and the tragedy that engulfs the lives of those oppressed into secrecy, especially around love and sexuality. Respectively coined a family tragicomic and a comic drama, Fun Home is brimming with references to Proust, Camus, Joyce, Scott Fitzgerald, and Radcliffe Hall, while Are You My Mother takes its title from the famous children's story by P.D. Eastman and weaves in lessons on the psychoanalytic theories of Donald Winnicott and the writings of Virginia Woolf, Adrienne Rich, and others. Alison Bechdel is a public intellectual of extraordinary scope. In her books, she often pauses her narratives to reflect on her own creative process. She draws herself doing research, editing, sifting through and selecting family photos, and penning the results. Her readiness to reflect on a book's creation matches the vision of the Hauser Forum. Her work has been recognized through numerous awards, including a MacArthur Award, which is commonly known as the Genius Award. And in 2013, Fun Home was brought to the stage as a musical and won 5 Tony Awards and numerous other accolades. Her most recent book, The Secret to Superhuman Strength, was published in May 2021. And now a word about today's format. After we hear from Alison Bechdel, Hilary Chute will join Alison for a discussion, and Hilary will moderate the Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, and we will try to get to as many questions as time permits. Now, tonight we have a kind of reunion of sorts, and that is that Alison and Professor Chu taught a course called Lines of Transmission, Comics and Autobiography at the University of Chicago in 2012. Hilary Chute has written extensively on Alison's work, and we are thrilled to have her here today to talk with Alison. Hilary is the author of 4 books on comics and graphic novels. Most recently, she wrote Why Comics? From Underground to Everywhere. Her timely collection, Mouse Now, Selected Writings, will be published later this year. Hilary Chute is the Distinguished Professor of English and Art and Design at Northeastern University, and is also a comics and graphic novels columnist for the New York Times Book Review. So I would like to thank you all, our audience, once again for joining us today. And now it is my pleasure to hand things over to you, Alison. The platform is yours.
Hi, Susanna, thank you. That was a very lovely introduction. I'm very honored to be here tonight at the Hauser Forum, especially honored that Rita Hauser is here. That's great. One of my very favorite things to do is to talk with Hilary Chute about comics. So this is not just a great honor, but I'm hoping it will also be fun. I'm going to talk tonight about time. I've been interested in time lately. I know Hilary has lots of really great insights into time and how time operates in comics. So I thought it would be a fun topic. I'm gonna be doing a little talk for about half an hour, and then Hilary will come on and we'll chat. My talk is titled The Psychochronology of Everyday Life. I attribute my personal preoccupation with keeping track of time to an early grasp of mortality due to a childhood spent in our family funeral home. Death was always very present, but in a very matter-of-fact way. And I started keeping a diary when I was 10. It strikes me now it's kind of perfect that this first diary was a calendar from one of my father's funeral home vendors. A burial vault, in case you don't know, is a crazy thing. It's a concrete casket that you put the actual casket inside of at the cemetery so it won't decay. And I sometimes feel that my diary, or at least my compulsion to keep track of the events of my life, is a kind of burial vault, this elaborate but futile attempt to ward off the inevitable. The main thing I love about memoir is the challenge of finding a coherent story in the random events of life. You can't make stuff up in order to have a tidier narrative. You have to stick to the facts. And one of those facts is time. That doesn't mean you have to tell stories chronologically, of course, but you do have to have a grip on the temporal relationship of the things you're writing about. So much of writing for me is, and I would say of writing in general, is figuring out how to sequence things, how to figure out what comes next in the story or argument. And I find that it's only by engaging in that process that I learn what this story is about or what I'm trying to say. So my dad got me started keeping a diary, and I have been keeping one ever since. As a child, my diary was just a log of events. But as I got older, it became more about my internal life. And then at a certain point, it split into 2 parts. I had a journal for reporting on my internal life and a date book for recording the events of my external life, often in mind-numbing detail. The boundary was never really clear though, and there was a lot of overlap between these two books. In my 20s, I transmuted some of this mania to chronicle things into writing and drawing a comic strip. Dykes to Watch Out For was a strip about the everyday life of a group of friends. I love the way newspaper comics are not just about daily life, but are part of it. There's something people read over breakfast or on the toilet. And my comic strip evolved into a serial that unfolded over time, episode after episode. I like that in the comic strip, in this serial format, you couldn't go backward. You could only move forward. I mean, you could have flashbacks, but you couldn't revise anything. Once something was written, it was part of the record. So my characters aged in real time. Current events shaped the narrative. I thought of the strip as a kind of archive, a way that I was attempting to accurately document the ethos of the time I was living through. And I drew the comic strip for 25 years until 2008. But about two-thirds of the way through that time, I also began working on a side project, a memoir. And this was a story I had felt called upon for a long time to write, about growing up with my father and finding out when I came out to my family as a lesbian in college that my dad too was gay. He and my mom had been keeping this secret all along. And then soon after I stumbled onto it, my father died in a suspicious accident. So it was a difficult story to tell for a lot of reasons, and it took me a long time to build up the determination to do it. But a big part of why I was at last able to do so was because I made a conscious decision to stop keeping these insanely minute daily records. It was becoming clear to me that this had become a kind of apotropaic behavior, you know, an attempt to ward off death and impermanence. I was keeping track of my life so obsessively to manage my anxiety about the fact that it was going to end one day. And I could see that the record keeping was just making matters worse. By clinging like this, I was actually throttling the flow of life and my own energy. So I slowly weaned myself off of this compulsion to write everything down. And I began spending time actually writing, beginning the story about my father. These are some of my very first notes, maybe my actual first pencil to paper. I had a sense right away that a story my grandmother used to tell us about the time my dad got stuck in the mud would be a part of this book. I don't know why, I just knew it had so much emotional resonance that there was no question it was a key part of the story, but it would take me a long time to figure out exactly how or why or where it would fit in. This is my first sketch of what page 1 of Fun Home would look like, how I thought it might begin, with a picture of the farm my father grew up on and the field where he had gotten stuck in the mud as a little kid. It was hard to put anything down on the page at all to really commit to beginning this book, as you can see by the overwhelming whiteness of this page. But I knew I had to start somewhere, and you can see the merest outline of the farm in that first panel on a tiny little shape of my father, a little speck there. So my father not only got me started as a writer by giving me the diary, he also inadvertently taught me something about graphic storytelling. The summer before I turned 7, my parents took my brother and me with them on a trip to Europe. And when we got home, we had all these pictures, which my father proceeded to organize in an album. But first, he got out a box of old photos, old family photos, and he started by putting those in this brand new album. And the first picture was of the family farm, this aerial photo of the farm where he was born. Next came various forebears and ancestors, and then came my dad himself. Eventually, there were my parents on their honeymoon. This was always exciting because I knew what came next. That was me. And as my father pasted photo after photo into this album, I was just thrilled. I found this ordering of reality positively breathtaking. Eventually, we got to the photos of Europe. These were all laid out in chronological and geographical order, from London to Paris, to the Riviera, to Rome. And I know this is not at all unusual. Most families have photo albums, but maybe because my family was lacking in other kinds of structure, I really cathected this representation of our past and our ongoing life. I looked through this album over and over and over throughout my childhood, and the other ones that followed it. And I still refer to them constantly in my work writing about my life. But one thing I didn't realize until quite recently was the way that these pages are a proto-comic book. This is the exact grid that I would go on to use in my memoirs. All 3 of my memoirs have this 6-panel grid, which is also not unusual. It's a very standard comics format, but it was just funny to realize this. So this is where I learned something about constructing a narrative out of images arranged in a sequence. And I kind of refined that about a decade later, the summer after my father died, and I had just graduated from college. I was home before leaving home for good, and I decided I was going to make myself my own photo album, my own family album. So I got out the box of old family photos to make this album, and I started picking photos out. I did it the way my dad had done, sort of in this genealogical way. First, there's pictures of my dad, then there's pictures of my mom. But as I was sorting through the pictures of my mom, I was struck by the way her face had changed over the years. This was a picture of my mom at about 40. It was a headshot from a play she was in. But when I compared that with her youthful 20-year-old picture, I was really stunned, like, wow, something had been extinguished in this person. And I realized this was a story, and I wanted to know what had happened. There were lots of clues in the photos of my father. Here he is as a young man in college. But here he's on the roof of his frat house. But who are these other guys? And was one of them the lover he told me about before he died? Why is he wearing a women's bathing suit in this picture? And then I found this photo, which I immediately recognized as Roy, one of Dad's high school students and also our babysitter, who would come with us to the beach the summer that I was 8. And finding this photo was the moment that I knew I had to tell this story. I assumed at this point it would be a story told in words. I hadn't yet become a cartoonist. I didn't even know yet that it was possible to tell stories like this in comics. But of course, when I did begin telling it 20 years later, it would be in pictures as well as words. And even though this picture was my portal into the story, it was not the beginning of the book. It came right in the middle of the story as a sort of centerfold. Nor did the story begin the way I had first conceived it, as my father's photo album had, with this picture of the family farm. But that image did come in a bit later. And now it's part of a much larger narrative than just the story of my dad getting stuck in the mud. It's the story of the whole book, which is the way my father and I grew up in the same place, in the same small town, but at essentially different times. And that generational gap between us enabled me to survive while he did not. But I couldn't see that story until I was almost done writing the book. I had to just keep chipping away at things to see where they led, like trying to make sense out of my father's suicide by examining and ordering various time-stamped documents. Having a date attached to a thing seemed to increase its truth value. There's a date on the edge of the photo of Roy, for example, which my father blotted out with a marker in this strange, ineffective way. Or here's my dad's marginal note in a bird book dated 2 days before his death. Here's a police report from the summer my father was arrested. Here's a note I got at work on the day he died. But the chief historical and time-stamped document that I relied on was my diary. And one of the things my diary as a historical document has enabled me to do is to see events related to each other in time. For example, I had very clear memories of all these disparate things, of the summer the 17-year locusts descended on us, of Watergate, of getting my first period, of helping my mother run lines for her role as Lady Bracknell in the local production of The Importance of Being Earnest, and of my father getting arrested, so that we almost had to move, except we didn't, because they were able to keep it quiet. But what I did not remember was that all of these things happened at once, the summer I was 13. And I learned that by these very, rudimentary entries I had made in my childhood diary. So after I got over how ridiculously over the top these things would be if I were writing fiction, I saw that, wow, this makes a really coherent narrative about leaving childhood and entering the adult world of desire and irony and evasion. And it was all true, and it was all in chronological order. So when I moved on to my next memoir, I thought I could trust that process. My next book after Fun Home was a memoir about my mother called Are You My Mother? For the longest time, I felt like Are You My Mother was somehow a failure, because whenever I needed to find something in it, a scene or a drawing, I had no idea where to look. I had to basically flip through the whole book from start to finish to look for the thing I was trying to find. There was no clear arc to hang on to that I could sort of, follow like a rope through the book. And I felt like that must be a kind of failure. This book does jump around in time. Fun Home jumps around in time a lot, but Are You My Mother does so even more erratically. I'm going to Well, let me just say that my mother, as well as my father, had a hand in getting me to keep a diary. Soon after I started keeping a diary at age 10, I developed this spell of obsessive compulsive disorder, and I was kind of obliterating my diary entries as I wrote them, which was crazy, and it took forever. And my mother started to notice that, so she decided she would take over my entries for a while. This was the day she did it. She began taking dictation from me. I write about this in Fun Home, but then it was such a pivotal experience in my life. I revisit it in Are You My Mother, in the book about my mom. So here's that entry again. Here we are again. I feel like this is the moment I became a memoir. It's someone who uses the stuff of their actual life as the material of their work. And you know, maybe because I think in a more easygoing family, we would have been touching, we would have been speaking affectionately, but those things weren't really happening in my family. So this is what this act of my mom writing down what I did that day became like everything got funneled into that tenuous little connection. And this scene, a woman writing down what I was saying, would become a theme later in my life. This book about my mother would also be about my experiences in therapy, which I felt had really saved me. I wanted to figure out why and explain it. And that led me to the magical psychoanalyst of play, Donald Winnicott, and to the modernist novelist, Virginia Woolf, who both became characters in my story. I imagined this scene where they might have crossed paths one day. Virginia is thinking up her next book, To the Lighthouse, and Donald is on his way to therapy. And both of these people had very profound insights into the relationship between the inside and the outside worlds, which I was very interested in exploring. These are examples too of the different kinds of time at play in this book, which might be part of why I get so lost whenever I'm looking for something in it. There's everyday time, but there's also writing time. There's dream time, and there's analytic time, which have different kinds of relationships, or if they have any relationship at all, to the time of everyday life. This was a session I had with my therapist when she was talking about my childhood diary and telling me that my parents were like putting this weird pressure on me by getting me to keep a diary, like I was going to carry their stress and strain for them by writing all this stuff down, and how that had screwed me up. And indeed, it has screwed me up. I still have this compulsion to write everything down. I'm always struggling against it, but it's still there. One other thing I want to say about this book about my mother is that it's very much about the unconscious. The connections between the scenes are all associative, the way you would associate in a therapy session. And you know, as Freud said, the processes of the unconscious are timeless. They are not ordered temporally. They are not altered by the passage of time. They have no reference to time at all. So maybe the fact that this book is just like a kind of incoherent jumble is actually a good thing. It's really a picture of how the unconscious looks. I wrote this book about my mother in the shadow of her death. In a very odd turn of events, my mother was diagnosed with cancer while I was on my book tour for Fun Home, for the book about my father. So the whole time I was writing this book about my mother, the prospect of her death was kind of looming over the book. So that was a very interesting thing to contend with. So in a way, Fun Home was about my father's death. Are You My Mother is about my mother's prospective death. And my next book, my next memoir, which came out last year, The Secret to Superhuman Strength, is kind of about my death, kind of about my grappling with my own mortality. It's very different from both the other two memoirs in that it proceeds in very simple chronological order. Each chapter covers a decade of my life. And since I was born in this nice round numbered year, my personal decades overlap very neatly with the chronological decades. It starts when I'm born and it ends the moment I finish the book at the end of 2020. But of course I didn't write it in chronological order. I was jumping all around in my writing process, even more than I did with Fun Home and Are You My Mother, in search of patterns and clues and meaning. I knew the book had something to do with facing my own mortality, but it's one thing to have an intellectual idea of that and another thing to actually do it. And that may have been part of the reason I was stuck for so very long on this book. I had a long phase of really not making any headway on it. And worse, I wasn't doing any drawing at all. It wasn't just that I wasn't drawing for the book, but for several years, I barely picked up a pen. And I love drawing more than anything. So this was a very odd state of affairs. But I felt stuck. When I was a child, I had loved to draw more than anything. And I did it whenever I could. I did it endlessly in this blissed out flow state. But I had definitely stopped flowing. But I tried something new. I introduced yet another diaristic practice to my regimen, which was a daily drawing. I figured I could at least make one drawing a day in my date book. So I started doing this practice, and I made my drawings not with a pen, but with a brush. And I would draw something I had actually done that day. The idea was to capture a specific moment of each day, kind of like a haiku, while it was still fresh, to convey something of the experience in this quick, loose brush drawing. Using a brush instead of a pen was a way of getting outside of my comfort zone. Pens are very precise and linear. Brushes are wild. You never know quite what they're going to do. And while they are linear in a way, they are also spatial. A brush can make a shape as well as a line, which is a whole different way of thinking and looking. Normally, my drawing process is very laborious with all kinds of sketches and studies and looking stuff up online. So these drawings are trying to counteract that. There's no sketching or reworking. It doesn't matter if it's not perfect. I didn't make this connection at the time, but I began this project right around the time of Trump's inauguration and the depths of that grim, hopeless winter. But I was thinking about, I wasn't thinking about this exercise as a way of managing my political anxiety, but it actually did help. As I got myself moving and drawing again, I can see that it really did help allay my anxiety. And I've kept the practice up now for years. I really love it. In a way, it's still me obsessively keeping track of myself in this kind of compulsive way I used to do in my date book. But it feels very different from that completist, split off cerebral approach of writing everything down. These are pictures, not words. The brush keeps me from getting too detailed. My mind and body are working together. I know that my body has a kind of intelligence that my mind doesn't. I know that even my drawing hand has its own intelligence if I would just trust it. So these drawings helped me to get back in touch with that flow state of childhood. In a way, the secret to superhuman strength, even though it's chronological and runs through the whole course of my life, it's also cyclical. It comes back to where it begins, because I'm constantly trying to get back to this childhood state of flow. So at a certain point, I realized I wasn't struggling with the fact of just my own mortality, but the mortality of humans as a group. You know, as the climate melts down and as our society starts to crumble, there was something bigger at work than just me facing my own death. I have an actual time machine in this book, and I use this time machine in my introduction to link different groups of writers who I refer to over the course of the book. First, the Beats. Here's Howell and On the Road in the window of a bookstore in 1957. The Romantics, in particular, Dorothy and William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And also the Transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller. These people were all writing about our relationship with nature, but they didn't have any idea that humans would actually have the power to affect the planet on the scale that we have. And it also struck me as funny that this particular group of people I was writing about begins with the Republican revolutions at the end of the 18th century and comes up to the present moment when that might all be coming to an end. This is a very grim place to stop, but I'm going to try and lighten things up by getting back to just my own mortality and not all of our mortality. I'm going to end my little presentation with a short reading from the chapter of The Secret to Superhuman Strength, which is about my 30s. In my 20s, I found and pursued my calling as a cartoonist. And in my 30s, my challenge was to go deeper with that work. So this chapter is about getting closer and closer to writing the book about my dad, as you will see. Oh, sorry, here's just another climate anxiety panel before we move on. That's me in 1970. Okay. Earlier in my 30s, I had just moved to Vermont and had thrown myself into biking and skiing up and down hills whenever I could. I began riding farther and farther. On my 32nd birthday, I did a solo century, 100 miles. I felt like I could ride forever. Had I discovered it at last, the secret to superhuman strength? My increased endurance carried over into my work life. I was always procrastinating, putting off beginning my comic strip until I'd reached the panic stage. But then I'd write and draw in long, intense bouts, often staying up all night. I would enter a state of hyper-focus in which things turned numinous. The world shimmered with meaning. As on a long ride or ski, the rest of life would fall by the wayside until I was finished. Then I would experience a brief moment of exultation before collapsing. Often I'd be so wired after one of these binges that I couldn't sleep. And once I did pass out, it was hard to wake up again. I was free running, a term I learned in an article about what happens to people's sleep cycles when they live in a cave. I loved the feeling of being liberated from time, from limits, from death itself. Coleridge and the Wordsworths were famous free runners, often out walking at night and sleeping till midday. Or at least they were for a brief golden period. In the summer of 1797, they'd leave Coleridge's wife and baby behind and go for long treks in the hills, talking about poetry. One of their favorite activities was to follow streams as they converged in the hills and flowed down to the sea. That fall, Coleridge wrote Kubla Khan. It's one of the most famous poems in English, thanks in part to its subject, human creativity itself. The ability to conjure things out of thin air. Just as the three defied the boundaries of time, their personal boundaries were rather permeable too. There was definitely more than the closeness of siblings going on between William and Dorothy, though most scholars seem to conclude that their intimacy never became physical. Coleridge was envious of their bond, but he was also a part of it. As Dorothy's biographer, Frances Wilson, puts it, three's a couple, and from the beginning, Dorothy and William preferred to be with one another in a triangle. Now I'm going to jump forward a little bit in the chapter. My 30s proceed, I get better at my work, I get involved in a long-term relationship, and I eventually faced this daunting task of writing about my father, but I haven't yet become immersed in it. Before I could really knuckle down on the dad book, I had another of my periodic comic strip collections to crank out. This deadline was by far my worst one yet. Near the end, after working for 48 hours straight, I found myself unable to fall asleep. It was like I'd broken my shutoff switch. In the preceding month, I'd been too busy to exercise. Plus, I seemed to have gone through an entire bottle of brandy. Why did I keep doing this to myself? What was the point? In truth, I was beginning to feel the press of that other, more absolute deadline. This was the year I'd turned 40. Coleridge once wrote to a friend, "My mind feels as if it ached to behold and know something great, something one and indivisible." That's what I felt like now. Amy's Torah chanting guide, alas, was in Hebrew. Someone had given this to me 20 years earlier, and I'd never opened it. I just happened, however, to see Joseph Campbell on a PBS fund drive. Near the beginning, there's an account of a dream very like one I'd just had. A woman comes to a clear river flowing over grass with no way to cross. But with luck and invention, she forges her own path. In real life, she's an artist. She has known the dark night of the soul, Dante's dark wood, midway in the journey of our life, Campbell says. Then he quotes the Katha Upanishad. Here, I burst out sobbing as if that razor had cut me. It's true I was in a bit of a state, but I am not prone to histrionics of this kind, nor was I even quite sure what the lines meant. But I kept reading for a long time. I sensed that I'd already embarked on this difficult path. The trick now was to keep going, to make a heroic effort. At last, I was able to sleep. Okay, so that's the end of my little presentation. And now, Hillary is going to join us.
Hi, everybody. And Alison, hi. It's so nice to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for that presentation and that reading. I wanted to start off by asking you to say more about something that you said that I wrote down. So I'm just looking at my notes here that was so fascinating. You said, my drawing hand has its own intelligence. And I love listening to you talk about time and talk about archives and comics as archives and being a self-archivist. And what I'm interested in is the idea that drawing, specifically drawing itself, suggests a certain view of time. So for example, the critic John Berger, who I really love, his book Berger on Drawing is one of my touchstones. He writes that drawing consists of assembled moments, and that drawing proposes the simultaneity of a multitude of moments. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about your thoughts about drawing specifically in time.
That's such a good question. I'm not going to have a smart answer, but I'm going to try. I mean, one of the things about drawing comics is that it takes a long time.
Yes.
I spend a lot of time sitting at my drawing table drawing, and you know, my life is unfolding as I do that. I'm not really, you know, I'm not doing anything exciting. I'm sitting there drawing, but I'm having this whole life, or this whole sequence of thoughts and feeling and all of that. I feel all of that somehow is infused in that line that I'm making. You can't help but have some emanation of what you're experiencing come out of a pen that you're holding. So I feel sort of, I love my drawings. I kind of hoard my drawings. I feel so proud of them when I'm done with them, because they hold all this time I've lived through.
Right. That's so interesting, the idea of the drawings holding time as opposed to capturing or freezing time, which is often the way people think of photographs, you know, stopping time, capturing time. And I was so struck listening to you just now and looking in your image of the photo album with the six panel grid, and then thinking about your comics pages that are often similarly gridded. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about photography in your work and also in your process, because it strikes me that your comics work is this sort of long, ongoing, multivalent conversation with photography in some ways, but it's doing something really different than photographs do vis-a-vis time.
You know, yeah, I don't think I ever told you about that whole childhood photo album thing.
No,
but yeah,
so interesting.
I've always been had a very intense relationship with photography as a documentary thing. You know, I'm very careful about taking my own photographs and organizing them and all that stuff. And over time, photography has really become an integral part of my drawing process. Not necessarily in a great way. I feel like, well, in the old days, before, you know, everything became digital, you couldn't easily use photography. You'd have to, you know, take a picture, take it to get developed, wait who knows how long to get the pictures back. So that didn't really work. But I had a Polaroid camera that I could use for like complicated poses, or if I had to draw a scene with multiple people in it, I would get my friends to pose and I would take the Polaroid. And that was quite expensive. It was like $1 per shot.
Right. Polaroid film.
I have a whole library of these Polaroids that I took, you know, before digital photography, organized by like hand gestures and, you know, places and activities. Anyhow, that's neither here nor there. But once digital photography did become available, and it was so cheap, and there was no waiting time, where you could instantly have a reference photo, I began relying very heavily on these photographs. I would just pose myself for whatever I needed. But well, I never trace photographs, because you can always tell when someone has traced a photograph in a cartoon and it looks terrible. I still do refer very heavily to photographs, and you can see that too, especially in Are You My Mother? I think it's most evident. Like there's this kind of I don't know, constipated quality to the line, because I'm looking more at the photograph than at the drawing itself. So I'm trying to rely less on the photographic image. It's such a handy thing to do, because it already does the work of flattening out the thing you're trying to draw into 2 dimensions. So it's like a hack, and I would like to rely less on it.
Well, I'd love to ask you a little bit about time and comics form. Again, it struck me listening to you narrate your 3 graphic memoirs, and also talk about your own obsession with sort of keeping track of time and ordering time in your own diaries and notebooks, that your comics are actually doing something nonlinear with time that's really interesting. But the whole idea of linearity and futurity and progress is so much a part of your work, even as you push back on it. So, just even the idea of doing a book about your father, that is obviously about your whole family in some way, and then sort of sequentially a book about your mother, that's also about your whole family in a way, and then a book about yourself. It's so interesting to me how much your work is about the idea of generations and time moving forward in that way, and the idea of filial relationships and filiation in general. So in some ways it seems really sequential and really linear in your focus on generations. But then, this is a fun part of Zoom. You can use props. I'm looking at your book, Are You My Mother? I took the cover off, and you use these techniques that we get in comics, like juxtaposition of elements in space, to such a powerful effect. So here's the opening end paper image for Are You My Mother? And I think that's your mother as a child, am I right?
Yes, but there's no explanation of that.
Right. And then here's the back end paper image. And I think this is you as a child, correct?
Yes. Yes.
And then if you put the book like this, we see it's on the front, your grandmother, I think, taking a picture of you. And on the back, your grandmother taking a picture of your mother. So there's this sense in which you're comparing yourself to your parents a lot in both of these books about them. And yet there's this kind of collapse of time that happens, like the incredible part of Fun Home that you mentioned before, that I always read as your dad kind of going off to die as a 3-year-old, like wandering off into the fields of mud. In a later moment in the book, you visit his headstone in the cemetery, and the narration reads, like, stuck in the mud for good this time. And so there's this incredible thing that you do in Fun Home where you collapse time so that it's all sort of reverberating all over the place. And your dad is sort of ceaselessly dying, and you're sort of ceaselessly missing him. So I just wanted to quickly, if I could share my screen, show an image from Fun Home that to me is really powerful. So it seems so strange to have me read it. Do you want to read it?
Sure. Yeah. It's true that he didn't kill himself until I was nearly 20, but his absence resonated retroactively, echoing back through all the time I knew him. maybe it was the converse of the way amputees feel pain in a missing limb. It really was there all those years, a flesh and blood presence, steaming off the wallpaper, digging up the dogwoods, polishing the finials, smelling of sawdust and sweat and designer cologne. But I ached as if he were already gone.
So thank you. It's just too strange for me to be in conversation with you and reading your words.
Yeah.
But this is just one page that I think shows how affecting your comics are in the way they express these moments where time kinds of it collapses. You say here that his absence resonated retroactively, echoing back through all the time I knew him. And so my question is, obviously you can address this thematically and explicitly in narration, but how does comics as a kind of syntax or a kind of language help you express these moments of time that feel weird, that feel collapsed, that feel layered?
I'm not sure, but I know that looking at this now, I can feel that the feeling of spiraling around the yard on the mower like that, which would just induce this hypnotic trance-like state. And I think that some of that comes through in this drawing, that feeling of a spiral. There's nothing really unusual about these drawings. They're straightforward images of real things happening, but I guess I hope that some of that energy of that weird spiraling lawnmower thing resonates off the page.
It does, and it reminds me a little bit, although you're calling it a spiral, of what you've also called the labyrinthine structure of Fun Home, where it's not chronologically structured, but kind of circles in and comes back out from a center. So I want to ask you about another, I think, signature feature of your memoirs, which you've touched on a little bit here, which is this thing that you do where you understand your topic in part through making historical figures into characters, and also by engaging with their works. So, in The Secret to Superhuman Strength, it's Margaret Fuller and Jack Kerouac, among others. In Are You My Mother, it's Virginia Woolf and the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, among others. And in Fun Home, for me, most prominently, it's James Joyce, but others fill that role too. And I'd be really interested, and I don't know how much you and I have talked about this before, so this is a truly honest question. Why do you do that? And what does it possibly have to do with thinking about time in memoir?
Well, on a very superficial level, I do it because my own life isn't that interesting. These other people are fascinating. Why not make use of them? But I also it's a way of linking to them. It's a way of getting something of those people, trying to know what they know, trying to link my experience to theirs. That was especially vivid to me in The Secret to Superhuman Strength. Really, really feeling like I was a part of a lineage with these people who were exploring the same kind of ideas and experiences. And I love that. I'm just alone here in my basement for 24 hours a day to think, to be able to touch Margaret Fuller and climb a mountain with Jack Kerouac. That's great.
So you just said something as kind of an aside that is so interesting. I want to follow up on. You said touch Margaret Fuller. And
well, I touch all of these people. It's all very intimate. You're drawing people's faces and their bodies. You are literally touching them.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. Can you say a little bit more about them, touching them, because you're materializing them from a kind of blank space?
Yes, yes. But I'm hopefully capturing something of that person's actual silhouette or the way that person stands. It's when I talk about my hand having its own intelligence, it has something to do with that. Like you can screw all that stuff up by thinking too much about it, but by trusting yourself and quieting your mind and just trying to draw, I think you can approach something of the other person. I'm normally very good at drawing caricatures or representations of real people, but I feel like if I focus, I can capture their essence, something real about them.
So thinking about these 3 books together, I already mentioned this a little bit, but The Secret to Superhuman Strength, as you were talking about also, is pretty different than Fun Home and Are You My Mother, in that it's, at least ostensibly, so linear. I mean, it's amazing to me that you begin the book with your birth in that image that you showed, right? Like the moment basically you come out of the womb and you're not yet cleaned off and you're this, tiny purple baby. And then there's this kind of open-ended aspect where the final page, which is the double spread, is meditating on your death. So there's this hilarious text box that just says, "Onward to the grave," on the last page of The Secret to Superhuman Strength. And I hope you won't mind me sharing this. If you do, just quickly tell me to shut up. But when you and I were corresponding a little bit before this event, we were talking about Helen Vendler, obviously a professor of English here at Harvard, and your mother admiring Helen Vendler's work. And this is something that comes up a little bit in your books too. And you had mentioned, and it's also in The Secret to Superhuman Strength, that when your mother was dying, she was memorizing Shakespeare's sonnets, and she asked you to help her memorize Shakespeare's sonnets. And she was also reading Helen Vendler and her criticism. And you had written to me that your mother refused last rites, but again, correct me if I get this wrong or you don't want to talk about this, but that she was very eager for you to queue up a video of Helen Vendler talking about her book, Last Looks, Last Books.
That is all true, yes. Helen Vendler did such a great service for my mother at the end of her life. It was incredible. My mom was reading Vendler's book on the sonnets, her like commentaries on the sonnets, and that's where she was memorizing them from. And she also had recently been reading this book, Last Looks, Last Books, which is it's an amazing book. I'm not like a poetry person, but as my mother was dying, I found this book on her bedside table and started reading it, and it was incredible, about the final poems of this group of different poets, and how those poems revealed something about death, which couldn't necessarily have been intentional because these people didn't necessarily know they were going to die. But she goes and looks formally at the poems and finds this incredible material in them. And it just helped me very much to process what was happening with my mother.
Well, it's so interesting to me that it was what your mother was interested in as she was dying, which is creativity as opposed to the sort of ritual aspects of facing death.
She didn't want to see relatives. I was like her gatekeeper. She didn't want people coming in. She certainly didn't want the priest coming in her room at the hospital. But yeah, she was rapt at this video of Helen Vendler.
So I just want to ask you a question about one of Helen Vendler's points in last books. She has this idea about which she writes about as a binocular view, or a kind of binocular style, in which poets can hold the sort of contradiction of different selves together. And in many cases, and this is in some ways the focus of the book, although for poets, it doesn't have to be the only way they experience binocular style. You know, one version of a self is a self that's dying, and one version of a self is a self that is in all ways, you know, vivacious and alive. And so this is just a quote from the book. She writes, "How can the manner of a poem do justice to both the looming presence of death and the unabated vitality of spirit?" So here's my question for you with this book, The Secret to Superhuman Strength, that starts with your birth and ends with this page that says "Onward to Death." Is there some way that comics can take on this binocular view in the way that Vendler is reading poetry as having a binocular view or style?
Yes, I love that. Absolutely. I mean, that's something comics does really beautifully. I think it's very simple to juxtapose the past and the future, different moments of time, different qualities of time, and to do it in this simple visual way that's immediately apprehensible. I wish I had like some time. If I had time, I would find examples of this, but that's a really great connection.
Well, at this moment, why don't we open it out to questions from the audience, which, just to remind everybody, should come through the Q&A function in Zoom. So let me open this up here, and let's see. This is from a person who is a junior at Harvard College, writing an essay on Fun Home through the lens of queer time and nonlinear time. And they write, "I was curious about how nostalgia plays into your work, both positively and negatively, especially as you work with and redraw your family archives."
Wow. That's a very good question. It's so easy. Nostalgia comes so easily, especially when you're looking at family photographs, because all the pain and the Sturm and the Drang is over, and you can just look back at these peaceful moments, which weren't that way at all. Actually, that's true of all my photos. It's that's the joy of looking back on life. You don't have to worry about what's coming next, because you at least survived until the next moment. But I never learned about queer time. Queer time was, something that happened after my formal education had ended, but I was just out living my queer time, not having the normal benchmarks that straight people did, not getting married or having children, being thought of as having some kind of arrested development. I also feel like being queer has enabled me to play with time in a way that might come to me more easily, since I wasn't built into all those pre-existing time markers. But I guess my relationship to nostalgia is just, always trying to be honest and see clearly, and not trying to imbue what I'm doing with anything except what is actually there, which is what any good writer would do, I guess, or try to do.
So another question here touches on memory, which I think is really interesting because even as we've been talking so much about time and keeping track of one's life, we haven't explicitly talked that much about memory. So the question is, how do you think all your various rituals and experiences of documenting your life have affected your memory?
They have definitely eroded it. You know, I mean, it's just a neurological fact that every time you remember something, you degrade it a little bit in your circuitry. So all my once pristine memories of my father have all become layered over with what I've written, what I've seen in the musical version of Fun Home, you know, things people have written about it. Like I've kind of lost my, you know, my originals. But I guess that's just a trade-off that I'm willing to make.
So here's a question from Emmy Waldman, who is a former graduate student of mine, and someone you've met too.
Hi, Emmy.
So Emmy, hi. Emmy writes, the secret to superhuman strength turns to Buddhist thought and practice again and again, suggesting how drawing, like exercise fads, becomes a meditative practice. You even dress like a monk making the book at the end in that image that you showed us. Is there something like Zen calligraphy as meditative practice in your turn to brushwork in the new book?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that was intentional. I would have liked to really formally study sumie painting, but I couldn't quite find anyone to do that with. So I sort of did my own half-assed version of it, using a brush and using just black or gray ink. But the thing about sumie is you have to do that kind of drawing spontaneously. You can't do a pencil sketch on your watercolor paper. You know, that would ruin it. So you might do preliminary versions to get a handle on what you're doing, but the drawing itself just has to come out of you spontaneously. And I just have always had this great yearning to be more spontaneous. You know, I'm such a plodding, methodical person. I want the kind of spontaneity that Jack Kerouac is always, you know, glorifying. I want to be able to just write a book, you know, without looking back, or make a drawing that's perfect. And sometimes that can happen. It certainly can't happen all the time, but with the right preparation and dedication, you can have moments when that happens, and that's the most amazing thing there is.
I like that idea of preparing for the spontaneous.
I know.
So this is another process-oriented question. And it is, I really love the way that words and images interact in your work. Do you write and draw simultaneously? That is, do you draft the words and images at the same time?
Well, I have a very idiosyncratic way of writing, which I stumbled onto as I was writing Fun Home. I started writing Fun Home just, you know, in Microsoft Word, like just a text document, but I found that I needed a way to think of the images too, and I couldn't really do that with just words on a page. So eventually I learned to write in Adobe Illustrator, which is a drawing program where I can type, but I can place those words in different areas on the page. So the page is a two-dimensional field. It's a page of the book that I'm laying out as I write. And I think of that as a kind of drawing, even though I often don't do any actual drawing, but I'm envisioning what the drawings will be in this panel and this panel. And that helps me to move forward in a way that I couldn't when it was just words.
So here's a question that's interesting. It's about time and the reader specifically, which I think is really fascinating because there's so much to say about creating comics and expressing time, and also reading comics and experiencing time. This person writes, I'd be curious if you could speak to how the form of your work and subsequent adaptations, maybe we can put that to the side, affects the reader's experience of time. And maybe if you want to bring musicals or films or television into it, you could in your response. So they go on. In other words, as I read a graphic novel, I can read it at whatever pace I want. I can flip forward and backward. I can engage the book as object. And yet when I see the musical adaptation of Fun Home, which Susanna Clark mentioned obviously in her introduction, but we haven't talked about much, my experience is dictated by the pace of the performance.
Yeah, well, that's one of the truly wondrous things about comics for me, is that, you know, self-pacing. I love to get lost in a complex drawing. I love drawings that tell stories, drawings that need to be read, you know, in the way you would read text, that like to really apply yourself to it. I always feel a little manipulated in time-bound kinds of art, like a movie or a play, and you're being told what to look at any given moment. I have a little taste of that when I do these readings. You know, when I read from my book earlier and I was able to show you images at exactly the moment I wanted to. It's kind of a little trip, a little rush to do that. So I can see the great appeal of, you know, having people, you know, follow your baton. But it's, you know, as a reader, I love being able to, you know, sort of free range feed on a page. I love that in comics you can see the whole spread at once. You can see what's coming even before you get there. It's a way, it feels like you're really trusting the reader, you know, to find their own way. And
so that's such an interesting response, and I'm hoping I can just jump in again briefly, and then I'll go to another public question, because Alison, you said something so interesting about simultaneity. And one of the things to me that's so interesting about what comics can do with time and space on the page is give you that simultaneous view of a page, of all of the panels juxtaposed in space on the page, and also give you that story in succession. So you and I have talked about this in the past as, you know, the synchronic and diachronic aspects of comics. And I should say to everyone, as I was trying to think about this for my own academic writing back in 2014, I was talking to Alison about it, and she very kindly drew me a diagram of synchronic and diachronic dynamics. So can you say a little bit about simultaneity in comics? More about that?
You know, I'm thinking of a scene in Are You My Mother of my grandmother in church. And right next to that panel, I draw myself in the same church, you know, many, many decades later, but the image is just of one altar of this church, but with the, you know, a 1920s congregation on one side and a 1970s congregation on the other side. I love the way that you can do that. I mean, it's in a movie, you'd have to cut back and forth. In comics, you can look at that all at once, these 2 points in time and history, and you can see them sort of fuse, which is what I was hoping to do.
Mm-hmm. I was trying to find that image since I had my book here, but
Oh yeah, you can never find anything in that book. It's impossible.
Like you were saying. So here's another question about audience that might be related. So the question is, Alison, you've spoken about your memoir comics becoming a bit of a therapeutic process in terms of the research, accessing memories and personal ephemera. Is the audience a part of that? It seems like maybe you were starting to talk about that in the previous question.
Well, I mean, I feel like I go down so deep into my own like navel, but my goal is always to find some commonality there, something to bring back out into the light of day to share with people. So I guess in that sense, it's about the audience. Like I wouldn't be doing this if no one were reading it. Well, actually, maybe I would. Maybe I would in my own little cell somewhere. I don't know if I'm answering that question.
Well, I mean, it seems like what you're saying is however deeply personal and even obsessive your work can feel for you, the goal is to communicate.
Yes. To get out of my basement and make human contact. That's the point.
Well, speaking of making human contact, I think the thing that Susie Clark said in her introduction about you being a public intellectual, like across different spheres, really resonated with me. And, this recent question mentioned the musical adaptation of Fun Home. There's a question here from one of my students who asks, can you speak about why you chose to have Fun Home be adapted as a musical? I mean, I'm guessing that obviously you made that choice to allow it to be the musical.
I agreed to that because on some level, I mean, the glib answer is because I sort of thought they wouldn't be able to do it. but the real answer is I don't have a relationship to musicals. I'm not like a musical theater person. I didn't have any idea how they were going to do that. So therefore I didn't feel territorial about it. It felt like such a different medium that I would be fine with someone, adapting the story into it. I did have qualms about a movie being made from it. And I didn't refuse the movie offer, but I asked for more money. And then I asked for as much money as I felt my soul would be worth, which at the time was $50,000.
That's the price of your soul? Good to know.
It's gone up. It's gone up since then. But in 2007, it was 50K.
Here's a question from a fellow professor and friend, John Najarian, who writes, I was wondering, do you feel like your understanding of time has changed in your years as a cartoonist? Do you think of time differently now that you did when, say, you first started working on Fun Home?
Well, I think of time differently because I'm a lot older. I don't know how much being a cartoonist has to do with that, but it is really fascinating the way time changes as one ages. This is very trite. Everyone always says that it speeds up, but it really does speed up in a most alarming manner. And, the past, well, it's weird too, because you still remember so much of your distant childhood very clearly, but the intervening years start to really, really disappear. Things I had once remembered very vividly are gone. That's a very boring answer, but. Well,
I mean, I guess just to jump in, do you feel like you had to create books like Fun Home and Are You My Mother, which are so non-chronological, in order to get to the place where you could write a decade by decade chronicle of your life?
Well, it helped, I guess, just to learn how to think of one's life in episodes and what's really happening as opposed to what seems to be happening. But it was really a fun challenge to fit my whole life into one book. Writing this book was a process. Writing Superhuman Strength was just this massive process of elimination. You know, I wrote so much that I had to get rid of because it just wouldn't fit. Things kept getting boiled down to their, you know, to a syrup.
I feel like that's the brilliant skill that cartoonists have. You know, comics is such a subtractive medium. Scott McCloud, the cartoonist and theorist of comics, has this great line that, you know, comics is a subtractive medium, but no one picks a comic book up off the stands and gasps in admiration at all the panels that were left out. You know, it sort of goes back to what you were saying earlier about the labor that goes into comics. It's so condensed, what finally winds up being on the page.
Yeah, I mean, when I was describing my crazy illustrator writing process, if you actually saw what I was doing, it looks insane. My pages are just like, they're filled with overlapping text in a way that no one could even read except me. And then it's a process of like starting to finally delete half of that and then revealing the story underneath.
So we have time for maybe just about one or two more questions. And here's one from my friend and colleague, Brian Norman. And he writes, Alison, you take up so many political matters in your memoir work. Is political time different than personal time or creative time?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, one thing I was trying to track in The Secret to Superhuman Strength were these, you know, political shifts that have happened over the course of my life. Trying to really show, like, when did things start to fall apart? You know, and they're very brief moments in the book, but there are a few little key panels in each chapter about who was president and what was the scandal around that particular administration was, and that felt like very much a part of this story I was trying to tell. We're all born into a particular moment, you know. Our lives are inextricably bound to the generation that we're a part of. Some people don't believe in generations, I just learned. But I feel like my generation determines who I am, even more than my parents determined who I am. So trying to find those cultural moments and touchstones was a part of writing this book about my life.
That's such an interesting answer. I think about your work as about generations in so many different ways. And I think that's such an interesting comment about your generation, sort of allowing you to be the artist that you have become in a way that was not as available to people in your parents' generation. Okay, last question, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of them. There are almost 40 questions here, and we are just about out of time. So thank you to everybody who wrote in with questions.
Yes, thanks.
This will be the last one, and I think it's a good, succinct final question. Could you please talk about what you think are the unique strengths and weaknesses of the comic format as regards the passage of time?
Okay, feels like my oral examination.
Right, and we've been talking about this, of course, throughout.
I mean, the magic of comics is that space between the two panels, you know, the gutter, the passage of time, who knows what's going on in that space, that magical, numinous space between the panels. 100 years could pass. A glacier could form and melt. You know, it's whatever you want to write about. So that's a rather remarkable thing that comics can do. I can't think of anything else.
Well, then I think this is an excellent moment to say thank you to everybody for coming tonight, and thank you to Alison for doing this. This has been so wonderful for me and for everybody here. And I'd like to just encourage everybody to check out the Mahindra Humanities Center's website for upcoming events, and to say to everybody again, including Alison most of all, thank you and good night.
Thank you all very much. Good night.
Good night.